The winds of Winterfell howled as Robb Stark stood before Roose Bolton, his suspicion gnawing at him like a wolf prowling the edges of a dark forest. There had been whispers, rumors, and too many unsettling signs pointing to one simple truth: Roose Bolton could not be trusted. Despite the facade of loyalty, Robb's gut told him the truth, a truth that had been hidden behind layers of scheming and subtle treachery. As the king in the north, Robb had learned to trust his instincts. Roose's demeanor was too calm, too collected for someone who had been invited to negotiate terms with the Stark forces after the betrayal at the Red Wedding. "Lord Bolton," Robb said, his voice tight with unspoken accusation, "you've served me faithfully, but something tells me that you're not the man you pretend to be." Roose looked unfazed, his cold, calculating eyes glimmering in the dim light of the room. "My lord, I am bound by my oath to you and your house. Any thoughts of betrayal are mere fantasies." But Robb wasn't buying it. The Red Wedding had already shown him the horrors of betrayal. His father, his brothers, and his mother were all slaughtered because of the treacherous alliance with the Freys. Robb had already lost too much. He could not afford to be naive again. "I don't believe you," Robb murmured, his eyes narrowing. His hand tightened on the hilt of his sword. The Freys, the Boltons, they are all cut from the same cloth. Before Roose could respond, Robb took a step forward, his blade drawing in a flash of steel. Roose's face flickered with surprise. But he was quick as instincts as a ruthless player in the Game of Thrones were honed. He stepped back, his hand reaching for his dagger, but it was too late. The blade of Robb Stark's sword found its mark with a swift, precise thrust. The Bolton lord's body slumped to the floor, a look of disbelief frozen on his face. Robb stood over him, panting with the exertion of the moment, his chest heaving with the realization of what he had done. In that instant, the North seemed to shift. There was no turning back now. Roose Bolton, once a symbol of a twisted loyalty, lay dead at Robb Stark's feet. The words of vengeance, of justice for his family, filled Robb's mind. He knew the consequences would be dire. The Boltons had a strong hold in the North, but Robb Stark wasn't afraid of the consequences anymore. His heart was hardened by the loss of everything he once held dear. As Robb wiped the blood from his sword, his mind raced. Was this the right decision? Could he truly trust anyone in this world of betrayal? Would this single act of violence spark even greater chaos? His instincts told him that by killing Roose Bolton, he had secured the North, at least for now. But as the minutes passed, Robb's thoughts darkened. Without Roose, who would hold Winterfell? Who would manage the fractured lands of the North that were filled with restless men loyal to the Boltons? Robb had heard rumors of alliances in the shadows. Would the Freys now see an opportunity to strike back? Could the remnants of the Bolton army rally behind another heir, someone who would thirst for vengeance? The shadows of doubt crept into Robb's mind, but he was resolute. He would move forward. The North belonged to the Starks, not the Boltons, and it was time to reclaim it. With a cold, decisive gesture, Robb ordered the Bolton banner to be removed from Winterfell, and the North's dark winter night seemed just a little bit colder. Robb stood in the great hall of Winterfell, surrounded by his most trusted bannermen and allies. His decision to kill Roose Bolton had sent shockwaves through the North, and now it was time to face the consequences. His heart was heavy, but his mind was sharp. The Boltons had to be crushed completely, their influence eradicated. He knew that without a strong show of force, the North could easily fracture into warring factions, with smaller houses jockeying for power. Lord Stark, one of his bannermen, a stern-faced man named House Glover, spoke up, his voice thick with uncertainty. The Boltons had many loyal men in the North. With Roose dead, they may see it as an act of war. We might not be able to hold Winterfell much longer. Robb nodded, his fingers tightening around the armrest of his seat. He knew that this was only The beginning. Roose Bolton's death would ignite fires, and there was no telling how far those flames would spread. The Freys, the Boltons' allies, would not simply let his act of defiance go unpunished. And there were whispers of other factions' traitorous houses in the shadows, just waiting for a chance to strike. "We will hold Winterfell," Robb said, his voice resolute, "and we will rally the North behind us. If Roose Bolton's death starts a war, then so be it. The Starks will not be cowed any longer." But the war Robb envisioned would not be as simple as he hoped. As soon as news of Roose's death spread, the North began to boil. Some houses, once loyal to the Boltons, began to withdraw their allegiance. Others saw it as an opportunity to make a play for power. The Freys, still licking their wounds from their disastrous betrayal at the Red Wedding, took the opportunity to strengthen their grip on the South. The Ironborn, always ready to exploit weakness, began raiding the coasts with even greater frequency. The greatest threat, however, came from within the North itself. House Umber and House Karstark, once staunch Stark allies, began to grumble under their breath. The Karstarks, in particular, were no fans of the Starks, having lost much during the early days of Robb's rebellion. As their resentment festered, they found themselves more inclined to join the Bolton cause. A few carefully placed whispers from the Freys could tip them in that direction. Robb's position, tenuous at best, became increasingly difficult to hold. Each passing day saw more unrest in the North. The lords of the North, traditionally loyal to Winterfell, now questioned whether Robb Stark was truly the man to lead them. Was he a king, or was he merely a boy who had lost his way? Meanwhile, in the shadows of the Vale, Petyr Baelish was watching. He knew that Robb's boldness would lead to his downfall. He had his own plans that would use the chaos created by Robb's impulsive actions to his advantage. Sansa Stark, still his pawn, was being groomed for a future far beyond what anyone in the North could imagine. With Roose Bolton dead, a vacuum of power had been created, one that Petyr would fill. Robb, meanwhile, found himself reeling. He had dealt with one betrayal, but now his kingdom seemed on the verge of shattering under the weight of even more. The North had always been divided, but never before had it felt so close to ruin. He needed to make alliances, real alliances, but his options were limited. Every house had their own grievances, their own ambitions, and none of them trusted him completely. The death of Roose Bolton had not united the North. It had split it further. In a desperate attempt to consolidate power, Robb called for a gathering of the northern lords. The great hall of Winterfell was filled with voices, each one louder than the last, as Robb struggled to keep control of the meeting. It was clear that many saw the Bolton death as a spark for rebellion, not a victory for the Stark cause. Robb Stark, Lord Karstark, sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You have killed Roose Bolton and plunged the North into chaos. What makes you think we will follow you now? You are no true king. You are a boy lost in a world of wolves." Robb's eyes flashed with anger, but he held his temper. He could feel the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The death of Roose Bolton had not been a simple victory. It had been a declaration of war, and now the North was crumbling around him. "Lord Karstark, you are free to join the Bolton cause if you choose," Robb said coldly. "But know this, the Starks will never bow to the likes of Roose Bolton or his kind, and neither will I." The room grew silent, tension thick in the air. It was clear that Robb's words had not convinced all of the lords, but there was a fire in his eyes, a fire that few could ignore. This was a battle that would determine the fate of the North. The storm was only beginning, and Robb knew that the true fight was yet to come. The days following the summit at Winterfell were fraught with uncertainty. The northern lords, divided by old loyalties and new ambitions, had left the great hall in a storm of whispers and distrust. Robb had known that uniting the North would not be easy, but he hadn't anticipated the depth of the divisions that still lingered. Despite his bold declaration, there were those who now saw him as a liability, a young king whose impulsiveness had already caused too much damage. Lord Karstark's defiance was only the beginning. Many others, including key houses that had supported Robb's cause in the past, began to waver. House Umber, once a trusted ally, sent word that they would not fight for a king who could not protect his own lands. House Mormont, the fierce bear women of the North, were also suspicious, their loyalty to the Stark cause never fully tested outside of their isolated island dot. To make matters worse, whispers of an approaching army began to reach Robb's ears. The Freys were gathering their forces, ready to strike at Winterfell, emboldened by Roose Bolton's death. Lord Frey, the one who had orchestrated the Red Wedding, saw this as an opportunity to seize control of the North once and for all. He knew that if he could kill Robb, the Starks would be finished. Robb knew he could not wait for the Freys to come to him. His scouts had already reported that they were on their way. In desperation, Robb sent word to his allies, trying to rally what remained of the North. But each letter he sent seemed to be ignored, or worse, returned with no reply. It was clear the North was slipping from his grasp, and with each passing day, it seemed more and more inevitable that his reign would be short-lived. One night, as Robb stood before the fire in Winterfell's war room, a shadow passed across the hall. He turned to see his mother, Catelyn Stark, standing in the doorway. Her face was drawn, and her eyes were hard with the burden of their past. She had been silent for days, but now, as the walls of Winterfell seemed to close in around them, she spoke. "Robb, you have done what you must," she said softly. "But now you must make a choice. The North is splintering, and you cannot hold it together alone. You must either seek true alliances or prepare to fight a war on all fronts." Robb looked at her, his heart heavy. He had always relied on his mother's wisdom, but he had never imagined that the war for the North would be this complicated. His decisions, his impulsive choices, had led them to this point, and now he was struggling to see a way forward. "I cannot ally with the Freys," Robb replied bitterly. "After what they did at the Red Wedding, I will never trust them again. And yet, without them, the Boltons have no power. They are the key to winning this war." Catelyn shook her head slowly, her expression unreadable. "The Freys are a poisonous lot, but they are not the only choice. You could find allies elsewhere. In the east, in the Vale, there are many who would see the Boltons brought low. But you must act swiftly. The more time you waste, the more ground you lose." Robb clenched his fists. He knew his mother was right. His pride and anger had clouded his judgment, making him see only one path: vengeance on the Freys and the Boltons. But Catelyn was suggesting something else. Perhaps there were other ways to win the North. Perhaps there was more to this game than simple revenge. "I will consider your words, Mother," Robb said, his voice strained. "But I fear I've already made too many enemies. The houses of the North are turning against me, and the Freys will stop at nothing to destroy us." Catelyn nodded. "Sometimes the greatest strength is in not showing your hand too soon. You must be patient. The North will rally to you, Robb, but only if they see you as a king, not just a boy avenging his family." The words rang in Robb's ears long after his mother left. He knew the time had come to reconsider everything. If he wanted to truly win the North, he would need to swallow his pride and take a more measured approach. The next morning, he called for a war council, inviting his closest advisors and bannermen. Among them were Brynden Tully, his uncle, and a few men from House Mormont. It was a small gathering, but Robb knew that the support of even these few houses would be crucial. "We must turn the tide in our favor," Robb said, standing before them. "I have acted in haste, and I see now that I must be more cautious. We need more than just the North behind us. We need allies in the south, in the Vale, and even in the east. We must build a coalition to fight the Freys, the Boltons, and anyone else who stands against us. Brynden Tully, who had seen enough of war to understand its many intricacies, nodded. You are right, Robb. The North can't fight alone. We must seek out those who have reason to see the Boltons fall. The Vale's forces might be able to assist. Even the Ironborn might be willing to offer support, given the right incentives. Robb thought long and hard about their suggestions. In truth, he was reluctant to trust anyone outside of the North, but he knew that his dreams of reclaiming Winterfell and avenging his family would require more than just the blood of the Starks. It would require a network of allies, each one with their own motivations and ambitions. Robb's war council began to shift gears. The weight of his past decisions hung heavy on the room, but there was a flicker of hope now. The urgency was clear. The Freys were advancing. The Boltons were no longer the only threat, and time was running out. The North could not afford another misstep. I have one offer for the Vale, Robb said, his voice firm. Petyr Baelish may have his own designs, but the Vale's army could tip the scales in our favor. If we can secure their allegiance, we might stand a chance against the Freys. Brynden Tully's eyes narrowed. Baelish is a snake, Robb. He plays his own game, and we may end up as pawns in it. We cannot trust him. But we may not have another choice. Robb hesitated. Petyr Baelish had proven time and again that he was a master manipulator, and Robb had never liked him. But he also knew that the Vale's armies could change everything. Without the Vale, it would be hard to stand against the combined might of the Freys and the Boltons. There's no other option, Robb finally said. We must reach out to him. If he's willing to ally with us, we'll take his help, and we'll deal with his treachery when the time comes. The room grew quiet. Even in their desperate situation, there was a collective unease at the thought of trusting Baelish. But Robb's command was clear, and his resolve had set the course. A messenger was immediately dispatched to the Vale with an offer of alliance. Robb didn't trust Petyr, but the situation was dire enough to force his hand. Meanwhile, in the east, the Ironborn had become an increasingly tempting option. The raids on the coast were becoming more frequent, and their leader, Euron Greyjoy, had made no secret of his desire to take control of the Iron Islands. Euron had long been a force to be reckoned with, but his thirst for power made him unpredictable. I'll speak to the Ironborn, Robb decided. I won't bring them into the fold unless it's absolutely necessary, but we may need their ships and raiding prowess to counter the Freys. I will offer them gold and a chance at vengeance against the Westerlands in exchange for their aid. Robb knew the risks involved. The Ironborn were not to be trusted, and their culture was one of raiding and bloodlust. But if the North was to survive, compromises would have to be made as messengers rode out across Westeros to forge these alliances. Robb began to prepare for the worst. His armies were still recovering from the wounds of the Red Wedding and the internal strife that had followed. Winterfell, though held, was far from the fortified stronghold it had once been. The walls were cracked, and morale was low. But Robb knew that the people of the North still remembered the strength of House Stark. If he could unite them, if he could rally them to his cause, they could withstand the coming storm. But his enemies were not idle. Lord Frey, with Roose Bolton dead and the Boltons fractured, began to marshal his forces for a march north. His first objective, to crush Robb Stark's claim to the throne and take Winterfell for himself. The Freys were still bitter about the failed betrayal and the losses they had suffered during the Red Wedding. Their rage would fuel their resolve, and Robb knew that they would not rest until they had eliminated the Stark threat once. And for all that, Robb spent sleepless nights on the edge of his throne, poring over battle plans with his trusted commanders. His war council was sparse, but there were a few key figures that he trusted implicitly: Brynden Tully, the ever-loyal Sir Davos Seaworth, and Lady Mormont, whose fierce loyalty was unwavering. These allies would fight for the North, and they would die for it if necessary. Robb was resolved to lead them into battle, no matter what it cost. Winterfell's banners were raised high once again, though now they bore the weight of Robb's responsibility in ways they had never before. Each banner was a call to arms, a plea for unity in a fractured kingdom. But even as Robb stood at the helm, he couldn't shake the gnawing doubt at the back of his mind. Would the North rally behind him? Or was he already too far gone, his name too stained by betrayal and conflict to bring the people together? On the horizon, the sounds of war were growing louder. The first skirmishes between Robb's forces and the Freys had begun. The tension between the rival factions of the North was reaching a boiling point. House Karstark, now more aligned with the Boltons, sent out their own banners, declaring themselves enemies of the Starks. Robb was caught between the need for alliances with southern lords and the demands of his northern allies, each of them with their own personal stakes in the fight for the North. But despite everything, Robb stood resolute. The lessons of this past had sharpened his mind. The mistakes he had made before, in trusting too easily, would not be repeated. Now, more than ever, he needed to control the narrative. He needed the North to see him as the true king in the North. For the Stark name to survive, he had to prove that he was more than just a boy with a sword. He had to become a king of strength, strategy, and unity. Winterfell was not just a castle. It was the heart of the North, and Robb would fight for it until his last breath. The days following Robb's decision to pursue alliances with the Vale and the Ironborn were a blur of constant activity. As his messengers rode south and east, Robb focused on preparing for the inevitable war. His scouts reported that the Freys were mustering a significant army, and their march toward Winterfell was imminent. Every night, the distant sound of hooves on frozen ground seemed to bring the inevitable closer. The North was on the brink of war, but Robb knew he couldn't let fear take hold of him. He had to be stronger, smarter, and more ruthless than ever before. The council was convened again in Winterfell's war room. The air was thick with tension, each face set with the grim determination of men and women who knew that their very survival was at stake. "Robb," Brynden Tully began, his voice gravelly with age and experience, "we cannot afford to wait for the Freys to reach us. We have to take the initiative. If we let them siege Winterfell, they'll have us trapped. We must strike before they do." Robb nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. He was familiar with the old strategies of battle, but the challenges before him were unlike anything he had faced before. The Freys were numerous, but they were divided. Many of them were not true soldiers, merely opportunists and pawns who had risen with the chaos. But their numbers were still a formidable threat, and their reliance on treachery and trickery meant that Robb could never let his guard down. "We must strike fast." "Then," Robb said firmly, "I'll lead the vanguard and take the fight too. The Freys, but we need the Vale, and we need the Ironburn. If they can't be here in time to bolster our strength, we will be forced to fight a battle that we cannot win." Lord Mormont spoke next, his voice as deep and unwavering as the bear's. "Of his house. The Ironburn are unpredictable, Robb. They'll come for gold, for plunder, and maybe vengeance. But their loyalty is as fickle as the tides. We cannot rely on them fully." Robb looked at him, his face hardening. "I'll offer them what they want. We need their ships to raid the southern coast and distract the Freys. If we can cut off their supplies, we can weaken them before the battle." There was a murmur around the room as Robb's strategy began to take shape. He would split his forces, one part to deal with the Freys head-on, the other to raid their supplies and cut off their reinforcements. It was a gamble, but it was the only one that might buy him the time he needed. As Robb's war council deliberated, word arrived from the Vale. Pettier Baelish had sent a response, a cryptic message that left Robb feeling uneasy. The message wasn't a promise of support, but rather an invitation to discuss terms. Baelish was always cautious, always looking for leverage. But Robb couldn't afford to wait any longer. He decided to send an envoy to the Vale. His terms were clear. They needed the Vale's army, and in exchange, Robb would offer Baelish a seat at the table of power when the war was over. It was not a promise Robb was eager to make, but he knew that Pettier would never act without extracting something in return. The question was whether the Vale would actually be willing to help, or if Baelish had other plans entirely. As messengers departed for the Vale and the Iron Islands, Robb turned his attention to his preparations in Winterfell. The walls needed reinforcing, the armory stocked, and his soldiers trained for the fight ahead. He spent long hours in the training yard, sharpening his skills as much as his men's. But even as he worked tirelessly to prepare, a gnawing sense of dread grew within him. The stakes were higher now. His father had once been a wise and just man, but he was gone. The burden of leadership had fallen squarely on Robb's shoulders, and there was no turning back. He was no longer a boy seeking vengeance for his family. He was a king fighting for the future of the North. Robb spent a quiet evening with his mother, Catelyn, by the fire. She had remained stoic throughout the preparations, offering only quiet advice and support. Yet tonight, Robb could see the worry in her eyes. "Mother," he said, his voice softer than usual, "I've made my decision. The Freys, the Boltons, the Ironborn, they will all fall. I will not let the North slip away from us." Catelyn gave a small, sad smile. "You have the heart of a Stark, Robb, but the heart is not enough. The North is no longer just about strength. It is about trust, about loyalty. And you must remember, there are always forces in the shadows, waiting for their moment." Robb looked at his mother, his expression darkening. "You think Baelish is playing me." "I think Baelish plays everyone," she said, her voice heavy with experience. "But we cannot afford to play his game. Not yet. You must decide what kind of king you will be. Will you be the king of wolves, or will you be something else, something more?" Robb thought long and hard about his mother's words. He had always been a Stark proud, bold, and fierce, but he was beginning to see the truth in Catelyn's caution. This war was not just about strength. It was about strategy, alliances, and the delicate balance between loyalty and betrayal. Robb had to be prepared for all of it. Every move, every decision would determine the future of the North. The next morning, Robb gathered his forces. The Vale and Ironborn had yet to respond, but he had no choice but to press on. Winterfell's defenses were stronger than they had been in years, and with any luck, his strategy would buy him the time he needed. The Freys were coming, and they were coming with vengeance in their hearts. Robb would meet them on the battlefield, but he had to make sure he was ready for the war that would follow. Winterfell's banners flew in the cold wind. The time for hesitation had passed. The Game of Thrones was about to begin in earnest, and Robb Stark would play for the North's survival or its destruction. The air in Winterfell was frigid, biting, and relentless. The heavy clouds overhead seemed to press down on the land, as if the very heavens themselves were watching the impending clash. Robb Stark stood atop the walls of Winterfell, his gaze sweeping over the snow-covered landscape. He had been in battle before, but the coming war felt different. This wasn't just about reclaiming his birthright. It was about survival. The Freys were approaching, their forces marching through the frozen fields, eager to avenge Roose Bolton's death and crush the last of the Stark rebellion. They were a large and well-equipped army, but Robb had always believed in the strength of his own people. The North had always survived because of their tenacity, their strength in unity. But now, as the banners of his enemies loomed closer, Robb couldn't help but feel the weight of doubt pressing on his chest. He had been relentless in his efforts. Secure alliances, the Vale's response still hung in the balance, and the Ironburn were still a question mark. With the Freys drawing near, Robb knew that time was running out. If the Vale didn't come through, if the Ironborn didn't make their move, Winterfell might not survive this assault. Robb, came the voice of Brynden Tully, breaking Robb from his thoughts. The old man had been by his side since the beginning of this war, his experience a steadying influence. You're looking at the horizon like it's going to change. We've prepared, and now we fight. We have the advantage of our home. Freys may be many, but they aren't used to the harshness of Winterfell. Robb nodded, though his mind remained clouded. It's not just about numbers. It's about the Freys' treachery. We've seen what they're capable of. Their soldiers may not be seasoned warriors, but they'll fight dirty. We have to outsmart them as much as outfight them. Brynden studied him, his gaze sharp. You're right. Their cruelty is their greatest weapon. But it's also their weakness. If we play our cards right, they'll expose their own flaws. The War Council met again that evening, Robb's mind still racing with options. Winterfell's defenses had been bolstered, but with the Freys drawing closer, he knew there wouldn't be time for a long siege. The Freys would move quickly, and if they had any reinforcements waiting in the wings, they'd attack from multiple fronts. Time's not on our side, Sir Davos Seaworth said, his voice calm but firm. We have no choice but to confront them directly. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. Robb knew what that meant. It was not just a clash between armies. It was a test of everything he had become since the death of his father. His ability to lead, to rally the North, was about to be put to the ultimate test. We strike first, Robb declared after a long pause. We'll meet them in the field, before they reach Winterfell's walls. We don't have the luxury of waiting. The plan was set in motion. Robb would lead a smaller force to ambush the Freys and cut them off from any reinforcements, while the main body of Winterfell's army would prepare to meet them in direct combat. The surprise attack would give Robb the advantage, but only if they moved swiftly and decisively. The days blurred into a frenzy of preparation. Armor was checked, weapons sharpened, and men were drilled into fighting formations. Robb spent little time in his chambers, his days filled with strategy and long discussions with his commanders. He was determined not to make the mistakes of his past, not to repeat the rashness of the Red Wedding, or let his emotions cloud his judgment. The night before the battle, Robb stood on the walls again, looking out over the snow-covered plains. The cold wind tugged at his cloak, and he pulled it tighter around himself. He could feel the anticipation building in his chest, the weight of command more oppressive than it had ever been. Tomorrow, he would lead his men into battle, and everything his family's survival, the North's future, would hang in the balance. You're still thinking about it, aren't you? Came Catelyn's voice from behind him. Robb turned. To see his mother standing there, her eyes weary but resolute. About what? He asked. The Vale, the Ironburn. The treachery of the Freys, she said, stepping closer to him. You think you have it all in your hands, but there are always more games being played, more betrayals waiting in the shadows. Robb sighed, looking down at the snow beneath his feet. I don't know what's worse anymore facing the battle. In front of me or the uncertainty of what's coming after. I've fought for the North, Mother. I've done everything I could to save it, but sometimes I wonder if I'm just a pawn in a much larger game. Catelyn placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle yet firm. You are not a pawn, Robb. You are the king in the North. And no matter what happens tomorrow, remember that. You've led your people with honor. That's more than anyone else can say. The next morning, The air was thick with tension as the armies assembled on the field. The Freys were on the move, marching toward Winterfell with the intent to crush the Starks once and for all. Robb's army, smaller but more nimble, moved quickly to intercept them. The clash would be fierce, and Robb knew that this was his moment. His men would fight for him, or they would die trying. The battle began with a deafening roar as both sides collided in the snow. The Starks, with their knowledge of the land and their battle-hardened resolve, fought fiercely. But the Freys, though disorganized, came at them with the madness of desperate men. The fight was brutal, chaotic, and unrelenting. Robb led from the front, his sword cutting through the enemy ranks as his men followed him with wild determination. But it was clear that the Freys were not the only threat. As the battle raged on, Robb felt something shift in the air. A new force was arriving. The Vale, led by Petyr Baelish, had come to join the fight. But would they truly be the allies Robb hoped for? Or were they just another part of the treacherous game Baelish was playing? The arrival of the Vale forces shifted the tide of the battle, but not in the way Robb had expected. Petyr Baelish had sent only a fraction of the promised forces, and those who arrived were not the seasoned warriors Robb had hoped for. Instead, Baelish's forces were made up of well-equipped, but largely untested soldiers, many of whom seemed more concerned with their own survival than the survival of the Stark cause. Baelish himself rode in at the rear, flanked by his most trusted men, a sinister smile playing at the corners of his lips as he watched the battle unfold. Robb felt a wave of cold unease wash over him as Baelish's forces joined the fray. There was something about Baelish's presence that unsettled him deeply. Even amidst the chaos of battle, Robb couldn't shake the feeling that Petyr had played his hand in a way that only benefited him. The Vale's arrival was supposed to be the tipping point, an opportunity to finally crush the Freys and end their campaign. But as Baelish's men entered the battle, Robb saw them acting less like allies and more like opportunists. Some of them targeted the Freys with fervor, while others seemed to be picking off the wounded Stark soldiers as if they were just as eager to fight for plunder as for the North. "Damn him," Robb muttered under his breath as he hacked his way through the Frey lines. Despite the treachery in the Vale's ranks, he couldn't afford to let it distract him. The Freys, who had been on the verge of breaking, were now being bolstered by the new arrivals. The battle raged on, turning from a fight for survival into a brutal struggle for control of Winterfell. Robb's heart pounded as he fought with all his strength. The snow beneath his feet had turned red, and the air was thick with the sounds of men shouting, swords clashing, and the desperate cries of the fallen. The Freys had dug their heels in, determined not to lose the battle they had waited so long to win. The Starks, on the other hand, were fighting for their lives, for the future of the North, and they would not back down. But as the battle wore on, Robb could see the cracks forming. The Freys weren't retreating, and the Vale's forces, instead of being the reinforcements they were supposed to be, had become an unpredictable element in the fight. Robb's stomach twisted as he saw Baelish directing his men from a distance, giving orders with a calm that bordered on cold indifference. The man had come to the battlefield not as a savior, but as someone seeking his own gain, and Robb knew that the longer Baelish stayed in the fray, the less certain the outcome of this war would become. "Robb?" shouted Sir Davos, cutting through the chaos to reach him. "The Freys are pushing back. We need to fall back and regroup." "No," Robb said sharply, his eyes burning with determination. "We keep fighting. If we fall back now, we'll lose Winterfell. We have to win this, no matter the cost." Sir Davos, ever the voice of reason, hesitated. "But we can't win without the Vale. Baelish isn't here to help us, Robb. We need to deal with him before we do anything else." Robb's gaze flickered to where Baelish's forces were fighting in the distance, his men now mingling with both the Freys and the Stark soldiers in a chaotic mix of battle. Robb had hoped that Baelish would be the key to turning the war in their favor. But now it seemed as though the manipulative lord had come only to watch the bloodshed, looking for the best moment to strike a deal that would benefit him. With a curse under his breath, Robb pulled back, leading Sir Davos and a handful of men to cut their way toward Baelish's position. He needed answers. If Baelish was going to play both sides, Robb couldn't afford to let him remain in command of even a portion of the battle. The North had already suffered enough betrayals. When they finally reached Baelish, Robb's heart sank. The man wasn't even sweating. He stood coolly, giving orders to his men as if this was just another game. His face held that insidious, knowing smile that Robb had grown to loathe. Lord Stark. Baelish greeted him with feigned cordiality. "It seems your forces are holding up well, despite my delayed entrance. I do hope I've been of help." Robb stepped forward, his sword still in hand, and his voice was sharp with anger. "Help? You've thrown us into chaos. Your men are fighting like mercenaries, not allies." Pettir's smile didn't falter. "Ah, but in times like these, my dear boy, chaos is the only certainty. What did you expect? Loyalty? From men who have nothing to gain but their own survival? In a world like ours, you should be grateful for what help you can get." Robb's grip tightened on his sword. He had hoped that, somehow, the veil could be the key to defeating the Freys. But Baelish had no interest in loyalty, only in the aim. And Robb had been foolish enough to think that he could use Baelish for his own purposes. "You've cost us enough." Robb spat, taking a step closer. "Get your men out of this battle, now." Baelish held up a hand, his smile still in place. Now, let's not be hasty. You need me, Robb. I'm your only ally in the south. The Freys will never yield, and the Ironborn are just as likely to betray you as they are to help. I offer you a future, a seat at the table. You're a king, yes, but you're still a boy, playing at war. I'll not have you manipulate me any longer," Robb snarled. The tension in the air was palpable, and Robb's men, though they were still fighting, seemed to gather around them in a wary circle. Robb's hand hovered over his sword, but he did not draw it. He needed to control this moment. Petyr Baelish was an enemy now. He had always been one. "I will never bow to you," Robb said coldly. "The North belongs to the Starks, not to schemers like you." Baelish's smile finally slipped, a flicker of cold calculation in his eyes. "Very well. But remember this, Robb. You may win today, but you cannot win this war alone. You will need someone like me." With those words, Petyr Baelish turned and walked away, leaving Robb staring after him with a fury that burned hotter than the battle around him. The battle raged on, but Robb felt the weight of Petyr Baelish's words lingering in the back of his mind. Despite the chaos and the bloodshed surrounding him, Robb knew that this was not just a fight for Winterfell. It was a fight for the future of the North. He had hoped that Baelish's betrayal would be the last of the scheming lords, but he knew deep down that there would be more. The Game of Thrones was a game of endless bloodshed, and no matter how hard he fought, he could never escape the dark. Manipulations of those who sought to control the realm, but he couldn't dwell on that now. The Freys were still pressing hard against his forces, and they had regrouped, fortified by their unexpected reinforcements. Robb's army was weakening, but his resolve was unwavering. Winterfell had to survive. The North had to survive. If he didn't protect them now, there would be nothing left to fight for. The sound of steel crashing against steel was deafening as Robb and his men pushed forward, cutting through the Frey ranks. Robb's sword flashed in the pale winter light as he hacked through enemy after enemy. His eyes burned with fierce determination, and his every move was calculated, precise. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now. Sir Davos rode up beside him, his face grim. The Vale men are doing nothing but standing back and watching. If we don't finish this soon, they'll grow restless and turn on us. We can't. Trust them, Robb. Robb gritted his teeth. I know, Davos. I know. We finish this, and then we'll deal with Baelish. But even as he spoke, Robb could feel the weight of doubt gnawing at him. They had the upper hand now, but for how long? Would the Freys fight to the last man, or would they fold under the pressure? And what of Baelish's Vale forces? He had thought they would tip the balance, but they were no more reliable than a wolf's loyalty in winter. The Frey commander, Lord Walder Frey's son, had rallied his forces in the center of the battlefield, trying desperately to hold back the Stark advance. His men fought like cornered animals, desperate not to lose the advantage they had gained. Robb knew that this was at the moment that would decide everything. If they could break the Frey lines now, Winterfell would be theirs. With a battle cry, Robb spurred his horse forward, charging straight into the heart of the Frey army. His bannermen followed, forming a wedge that split the enemy ranks. For a moment, the Freys faltered, their confidence shaken by the fierce onslaught. Robb's sword flashed, cutting down enemies in his path, and the sound of Frey soldiers screaming in retreat filled the air. But just as it seemed the tide had turned, the ground beneath Robb shifted. His horse stumbled, throwing him off balance. Before he could recover, a group of Frey soldiers surged forward, surrounding him. His sword swung, but he was quickly overwhelmed. He fought desperately, feeling the pressure of their numbers closing in on him. Robb's chest heaved with each swing, but fatigue was beginning to take its toll. He was only one man, after all, and the Freys were relentless. A flash of steel cut through the air, and Robb felt a sharp pain in his side. He gasped, stumbling backward as the blade drove into him. He looked up to see a Frey soldier grinning at him, his face twisted with cruel delight. Robb's vision blurred as the blood poured from his wound, but he didn't let go of his sword. He couldn't. The fight wasn't over yet. Suddenly, there was a roar from behind him. Robb turned to see his bannermen pushing forward, fighting through the Frey soldiers to reach him. They formed a protective circle around him, fending off the attackers with ferocity. Sir Davos was at his side in an instant, pulling him out of the fray. Get him back to the lines, Davos shouted, his voice urgent. Robb stumbled, clutching his side, but he could hear the battle continuing around him. He could still hear the cries of his men and the clash of swords. The Freys were retreating, but it wasn't over. Not yet. With the help of his men, Robb was carried back toward Winterfell's walls. The pain in his side was intense, but he gritted his teeth, refusing to show weakness. They had to win this fight. Winterfell had to hold. But as they moved back toward the castle, a bitter realization began to settle in Robb's heart. Even if they defeated the Freys, even if they held Winterfell, they would still have to contend with Baelish. And he couldn't trust pettier Baelish. Not anymore. The walls of Winterfell loomed ahead, and Robb's strength was fading. He knew he had to make a decision soon. With the Freys retreating, this was the moment to strike at the heart of the betrayal. But could he trust anyone now? Could he afford to let Baelish continue to play the game? As they reached the safety of the castle, Robb's mind raced. There was no time to waste. The fight for the North had just begun, and it would take more than strength to win it. It would take cunning, strategy, and perhaps the hardest decision of all, whether to fight the war with honor or to play the game of thrones.